A number of heroes emerged this morning in a tragic fire at 575 East 165th Street in the Bronx that claimed the life of one man and left 4 other persons injured.
The young boy was leaning from the window, right? So he was saying, catch me, catch me. So he jumped from the top floor, and we caught him. We broke his fall.
But the fire department didn't come until after all the people had jumped out.
Wasn't no fire engines at all. We was the fire engines.
I grew up in the South Bronx in the 1970s, during the time of the fires. To me, it was home.
I'd wake up and the building next door was on fire. The building down the block was on fire.
Houses were disappearing.
6-story buildings from corner to corner, empty, vacant.
In 10 years, we lost nearly 80% of our housing to fires. Around 250,000 people lost their homes.
People wound up ruining them. They didn't care about property. In fact, they don't even care about life as far as I can see.
Some fires, accidentally or intentionally, are set by vandals, children, addicts, and derelicts.
What we always heard was that the South Bronx burned for 10 years because the people in the community burnt it. But when I think of the South Bronx, I think about all the people that I love that passed through that firestorm. This is where I played ball. This is where I hit my first home run. This is where I had my first kiss. We did not burn the South Bronx. In fact, we were the ones who saved it. The Bronx is still my home. I worked most of my life in the Bronx. I raised my children here. This is my place. It's still hard to accept that that could have happened and that it did happen. This was my old building. This is 986 Leggett. All of these buildings here burned. All of Fox Street here burned. A lot of us still believe that we were to blame, because that's the only story that ever gets told about the fires. But I could never let that go. What really happened to us here? Do you want to put some garlic on that or no? Too much?
Maybe a little bit of garlic.
Ooh, we have different color peppers, Antonio. Which one?
Ooh,
Antonio's the second of my 3 children, just back after college. My kids are always hearing me talk about the old neighborhood. Where we set our roots is part of the legacy of who we are. So this is Grandma Carmen and her 2 brothers when they first came here. They were in suits. And and probably really scared. Because, Grandma Carmen came when she was 10.
I figured my father wanted something more. Okay, he came to the States about 1948, and we followed him in 1951. In the 40s and then in the 50s, there was a big migration from PR to here.
My grandparents decided to leave Puerto Rico while the United States was carrying out Operation Bootstrap. That policy was pushing Puerto Rican farmers into the cities to work in factories. But there weren't enough jobs, and most people were struggling to survive. As U.S. citizens, we could go up north. Hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans left their homes behind in search of a better life. My grandfather decided that he was going to try his luck in New York. People wanted to come to the greatest city in the world. Why not them?
And we came to live in 160th Street in the Bronx. A lot of memories in this block. We made a new community, and we want to do everything to be better. We lived in the building in the corner from that block. After the pawn shop, that was my father's store used to be.
My grandfather had a candy store. My earliest memories are of us playing out in the front.
Once you came across the First Avenue Bridge to come into the Bronx, it was like going, to another world. I mean, the Bronx was it. Mike Amadeo was one of many looking for a way out of crowded Harlem and East Harlem. If you moved to the South Bronx, it was a step up.
Yo tengo todavía discos que yo le compré a usted aquí.
Bueno, yo llevo ya casi 48 años aquí y 9 ya.
Y no te vas a retirar todavía.
¿Qué va? Who ever thought that I was going to be the owner of this store? Something God put me here. In those days, New York City was segregated, but not the South Bronx. There was this brief time when these neighborhoods were some of the most integrated places in the whole country.
We have everything here. We have Irish and a lot of Italian and Jewish people live there. It was a very tight community.
Our African-American neighbors had come from the Jim Crow South, looking for a better life, just like us.
We moved from Harlem to the Bronx when I was 3. We were the first African-Americans to move into Lyman Place as homeowners. So my window was that front window. You could hardly see it.
Is this the house that your dad bought?
Yes, in 1940. It had a wood picket fence, and I said, "Oh, Daddy, is that our house?" And right away, I was starting to protect it.
My family came to the Bronx in 1957. I was about 9. That's when my venture started, I guess. Seeing different people. Kelly Street was like a melting pot where there's no Puerto Rican, black, Jews. Everybody was together. Everybody played football together, stickball together, party together.
All this big musicians, they all came to play at 845, right across the street from my store. And I used to go every single week.
As soon as the weather got nice, out would come the instruments, the bongos, the congos, the cymbales. And then the Irish would start playing their Irish music back, so you had these music wars going out the windows. That's what made the neighborhood great.
When you heard that music, it was just so electrifying, and you couldn't wait to go and dance there.
We
We grew up here on Leggett Avenue, just a few blocks away from my grandfather's candy store. I haven't been back inside that old apartment since I was a teenager.
Hi. Thank you for letting me in.
Oh my God. I remember being part of a community.
I used to lock myself in this bathroom to do my homework because there was always so much noise.
At school, we sang the American, the African American, and the Puerto Rican anthems. There was this openness to our lives and sort of this sense of opportunity and excitement. It felt like we were all the same. Our families were setting roots down here. But our neighborhoods were being targeted by government policies based on race. It started with redlining.
Redlining. When this first starts in the 1930s, any neighborhood that has 5–10% Black or Puerto Rican population is seen as a declining neighborhood. The federal housing agencies, banks, insurance companies, they start taking maps and literally drawing lines around them based on which neighborhoods are a good risk and which ones are bad. If a neighborhood had a red line drawn around it, it's a bad bet. Don't give a loan there. Don't give out homeowners insurance, fire insurance.
Our housing stock in these redlined areas was already old. These were pre-war buildings, and they were left to rot. Things in the neighborhood became even worse when the government implemented urban renewal, which tore down so-called slums in Manhattan.
The greatest slum clearance project on record goes forward. This poor tenement area is to be used for modern apartment buildings and parks.
New York City uses urban renewal to demolish its slums and build Lincoln Center, to demolish its slums and build middle-class housing for Columbia University and new areas near NYU. It gets rid of all the unsightly industry that was along the rivers. No jobs along the docks. All of that is gone.
It's something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. Yet it means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact.
Slum clearance targeted African American and Puerto Rican communities in Manhattan. Over 100,000 people's homes were demolished.
People are displaced, and they go on the subway lines to the Bronx.
I thought that the Bronx always had a bad reputation. But it didn't get its reputation until urban renewal displaced 100,000 people into our decaying buildings. From here on, it would only be described as a ghetto. And these policies weren't just in New York City. They were enacted upon people of color across the country.
Years ago, the neighborhood was Jewish and Irish, with a scattering of others. Now it's a neighborhood of the others.
Our neighborhoods were going into decline. But news reports didn't want to talk about redlining or policy. They just wanted to talk about us.
I think they have to learn to live the way we do and take care of things.
And they
they played on people's fears.
This is a new element. This is a different element. Every kid carries a switchblade knife. Every one of these kids are potential killers.
What about some of those criticisms that the Negro is dirty, that the Negro is more violent, therefore the Negro doesn't make as good a neighbor?
Well, that's because they have never given the Negro the chance.
What can I tell you? It just changed. Everything changed. Everybody started to move. It was a heavy thing to leave there. We had relatives there upstairs. I had cousins. But of course, they were moving too.
Everybody that lives with the colored has to move.
Why?
Because you're not safe walking the streets at night. You cannot leave the house.
We had neighbors who moved to Florida. We had neighbors that moved upstate. For white people, it was easy to leave. Urban planners like Robert Moses had carved up the Bronx with highways, allowing people to drive straight to the suburbs. The government would even help subsidize the mortgage. All you had to do was qualify.
But the blacks and the Puerto Ricans can't get that. If you were black or Hispanic, you weren't given a mortgage for a suburb.
Right, you couldn't move into a neighborhood that you wanted to move in. You couldn't get a mortgage to move out. My father wanted to get a loan to buy a house in Soundview. For a quick while, we sort of had this hope that we were going to be homeowners. Like, oh, we're going to move to a house. We're going to move to a house. It was very exciting. And then all of a sudden, that topic just ended. He worked for the same company for so many years, yet he wasn't eligible for a loan. Why? Why wasn't he not eligible for a loan? It was painful. We could see the neighborhood changing around us. Trash in the streets. The buildings weren't being kept up. Many of our landlords had sold their buildings to speculators. They chopped up the apartments, squeezing more people into smaller spaces.
We don't have no heat in the building. We don't have no water. We have to go outside to get the water because the landlord doesn't want to do anything in the building. We know he's not going to do anything about it. He just wants to get the money and go.
The new landlords wouldn't fill the boiler in the winter, even when it was freezing out. People had to use the ovens and electric heaters just to stay warm. And the old wiring in our buildings couldn't handle the new appliances. It wasn't any one thing. It was all these things that eventually led to the fires.
(1968), it went crazy. I was shipped up to 85 engine north of Caldwell Avenue, where I live. We were in the eye of the storm.
Screaming, everybody screaming outside, and everybody running, and all the trucks and everything that goes with it. Believe me.
Fires were on the rise in our neighborhood. But the response wasn't what it should have been.
In the 60s and 70s, fire was in the air. Fire was a political weapon. Fire was everywhere. People were angry.
People had good reason to be angry. The news called them riots, but when we watched them unfold on TV, we saw them as rebellions against abuse and neglect.
We can't call this housing, we just call them dumps. Roaches live with you, they don't pay no rent, but you do. The roof fall on you. Your children eat lead poison paint.
Groups like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers were exposing the truth about the conditions in our neighborhoods.
We have to move to a position where we can control the housing in our neighborhoods so that we're not exploited. And so that the owners of those apartments don't live in the suburbs grabbing the profits from us.
But to most of America watching TV at home, we were just angry and out of control.
What happened? What went wrong? Burn, baby, burn. Round out. We shall overcome.
But the Bronx wasn't burning in a protest or a riot, or because we didn't know any better.
Commissioner O'Hagan, why the rise from 64 on? Why is the city burning?
If you bring a poor family out of the deep south with a promise of opportunity and put him in an urban center for the first time and crowd, without exaggeration, 15 to 20 people in an apartment that was occupied maybe by four to six people in the past, people who have never lived in this type of an environment before, crowded into, living quarters that they're not familiar with. It's not surprising that you have an increase in fires.
If I live in a building, I'm not going to burn the building because I got the little shit I hustled for to be in there. I don't want it burned. My mother and father lived here since they were kids. I lived here when I was a kid. And now you're going to tell me go move someplace else. What for? I live here.
This was my first memory of a fire. I'm looking out the window, and right in front of me, there were just flames. I had a very good friend. We would sit together in class. We were really close. Her building burned that night.
The next day she was gone. She never came back.
A family of 3 had lived in this apartment, a divorced mother and 2 children. Like 12 other families who lost their homes in the fire, they left the building with little more than the clothing on their backs.
I was too young to know why. I just knew I never saw her again. By then, the fires were spreading quickly. This would have been the time for the fire department to stop them. I'd like to see as much as I can about what was going on in the fire department at that time. The runs, the closings, how many people worked there, how many firefighters.
There's tons and tons of stuff up here.
How would I find how many fire companies and how many firemen worked overtime? Like what the changes? How would I find what the changes were in fire companies?
I don't think they keep records like that. Like, you know what it was? It was so fast and it was so overwhelming. We think that they didn't even record half the fires.
They didn't even record half the fires? Fires in the city increased more than 50%.
The New York Fire Department responds to nearly 250,000 calls a year, and the busiest district is the South Bronx.
You know, what I keep hearing and reading is that at the time when there were so many fires in the South Bronx, firehouses closed. On the one hand, There could be legitimate reasons for why fire companies were closed. Makes me wonder why.
I'm very pleased to announce that the Rand Corporation and New York City are engaged in a series of discussions which will lead to a major involvement by the Rand Corporation in urban problems here in New York City.
In the late 1960s, the city was sliding towards bankruptcy.
City services get more expensive all of the time. How do you get a bigger bang for the buck?
Mayor Lindsay hired the Rand Corporation to help trim the budget. Rand Corporation analysts claim that their computer models would help win the war in Vietnam. And now they promise to fix the city.
Rand Corporation was assigned to the fire department to try to reduce the cost of fire protection in the city, using Rand computer models to predict future trends. John O'Hagan, head of the fire department, started eliminating fire companies.
All right, gentlemen, we've provided you with a memorandum which is self-explanatory and explains the reasons for and the details of the economies that will be made in the fire department.
They are closing fire companies, mostly in poor neighborhoods with very high fire numbers, while neighborhoods that have lower fire numbers are untouched, and in many cases are gaining companies.
I would talk to these Rand consultants. Why was that decision made? It makes no sense. And this consultant said to me, management decisions are logical and they make sense. But that was a political decision. Political decisions do not make any sense.
Well, there are 8 companies that are to be eliminated. We're suspending the 7-man manning and adaptive response in the Bronx, which will save $500,000. How much money do you save?
For those people who have the power and the authority, we didn't matter. In the South Bronx, where we needed fire protection the most, it wasn't there. It's like the rug comes out from under you and you don't really know what happened. Our parents came here to start a new life. Next thing you know, the Bronx is burning. They didn't see that coming. The community did not see it coming. They're in it. They can't see out from under it. They can't see that there are all these forces at play.
We see Americans hating each other, fighting each other, killing each other at home. We see cities enveloped in smoke and flame. We hear sirens in the night. Let us listen now to another voice. It is the voice of the great majority of Americans, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators.
A memorandum sent by Presidential Advisor Daniel Moynihan has angered civil rights leaders. In it, he argued that the traditional economic gap between black and white in the North is virtually closed, and that the race issue would now benefit from a period of what he chose to call benign neglect.
Here's this man who was considered a progressive Democrat putting out there that the problems of the cities should be ignored. The infrastructure, the schools, the hospitals, the sanitation, parks, they're all declining. And what the government has to say is just leave it that way. Let them burn because they're creating too much of a ruckus. Moynihan rejected this reading of his memo when it was leaked to the press.
I didn't make any suggestion of the kind, whatever. I say we have to calm down the rhetoric of racial accusation and paranoid sensitivities among whites and blacks, and carry on the substantive improvement in conditions that has been taking place.
influence, which allowed federal policy to continue to ignore what was happening in the South Bronx. And Moynihan went one step further. He also wrote that when people like us in the ghetto have fires, they were set on purpose, saying that fires were a leading indicator of social pathology. He's saying we set the fires because there's something wrong with us.
This is the Bronx in New York. 1.5 million people live in this borough, equal to the population of Houston or Washington or San Diego. Once home of industry, progress, jobs. Now someone is burning down a building, a landlord for profit, a tenant for revenge, junkies, vandals. It happens 30 times a day.
By the time I was 10, 11, 12, there was not just fires. There was neglect and abandonment everywhere.
We have all our mechanical brooms dump their loads here. By the end of the day, we pick up all the piles and make one trip to the dump. This saves the city a lot of money, gas, and everything.
Nobody's aware of the fact that we got a city dump right here in the backyard. That's a nice thing to do in the morning. Get up and open your window and see sanitation trucks dumping garbage in your back door.
The visual reminder that we received every day was that you're nothing. You're nothing. This is where you live. This was my middle school graduation. It was the last time that we were all together as friends because we all went to different high schools and there were kids not coming to school.
When did that start appearing?
The losing of people? By the end of middle school, life became hardcore.
It started back when I was in high school. This building was abandoned. That building was abandoned. It didn't phase on me that this was happening. I just noticed there's nobody living in this building anymore.
Then vandals would run in and pull out the plumbing. The night before I saved this house from vandalism, they were about to roll out all of the radiator systems. I used to sleep with my boots on. I had to be ready to jump up and run, jump up and fight, jump up and do whatever had to be done at a moment's notice.
I stood here for 3 years with no landlord or nothing. There was a phantom landlord collecting money. I don't know who the person was. I still have the
receipt?
Receipts.
Everything around us was crumbling, and we were all trying the best we could to survive.
You were afraid to walk in the streets because you don't know what's going to jump out at you.
I never wanted you to come this way or anything. Don't walk anybody, don't go that way. We didn't take chances.
Many of my friends who did the right thing, went to school, ended up on drugs, dead, going to jail. I could have easily been one of those people. How could children like that thrive, like in that community? How could we have thrived?
It was very hard.
Right, it was very hard.
Whatever I had to do, I did.
Yeah, you did. You got us through. You're brave.
No, I learned. I learned a lot. We used to tell our landlord, don't abandon us because we can't live anywhere else. My children were all born here and we're trying to get our lives together and make something better for them.
the sense that I get, and there's this internalized sense of guilt and of shame for not being able and not working hard enough or not having what it takes to elevate oneself out of that circumstance.
We did blame ourselves because that's what we internalize. Wait, because we're living in it. Why are we doing this to ourselves? You know, it was complicated. And it's awful because I think that in many ways we still blame ourselves.
This is where the club was. This is exactly
This is where the club was. Hello, can we come in? Psychedelic, black walls. I wasn't allowed in there. Are you kidding? My dad.
Not just your parents. Some of the guys was not going to allow you in there.
But you know how it is with little kids. During the day, we used to run in to look and then run out.
Nah, it was exciting.
My sister and I, we told a straight line for the most part. We were goody two-shoes, but the gangs were part of my community.
Everybody that I was hanging with, we were coming from those areas of burnt out buildings. We all were in the same mindset. What's the point? This is what we have. This is what we have to live with. When I moved to the Bronx, gangs started to flourish. And everywhere I turned, there was a different gang. The friends that I made that I would kick it with in the stoop, they called themselves the Savage Skulls. These were my brothers and my sisters. You could not tell me, you know, I didn't belong to them and they didn't belong with me, you know?
On my block, we had a gang, the Dirty Dozens. You know, they did things that were wrong, but they also cleaned the buildings. They played with us. They helped us start a softball league. We didn't have a relationship with the police department. The guys who protected us were the guys from the gangs.
The Dirty Dozen, they lived there on one side and the others live on the other side. The gang that was in the building, they say, we live there, the building is going to be safe, so you don't worry about it.
Remember when you used to sell Avon to all the wives of the gang members? Do you remember that?
I had my market there.
By the mid-1970s, nearly all of our buildings had seen some kind of fire. And now arson was becoming commonplace.
The youths in the neighborhood seem to get some enjoyment out of using some form of accelerant, usually gasoline.
Arson. 3 boys, 9 to 11, seized in a Bronx blaze.
There was a building on Tiffany Street. And the owner approached my brothers to burn 2 buildings in that block. They agreed, and then they approached me. We living in the street. If you give us $250, that's a lot. You know, it's more than our moms could ever afford to give us. I wasn't one of the girls, I was one of the boys. You know, when I was growing up with them, I would do anything for them. I had this strange thoughts that used to come to my head, like, you know, if I go with them, you know, help them and watch the cops, I had this crazy notion that at least I'm keeping them out of prison. This is how I thought.
Was there a time when you were involved in torching a building that you regretted?
Every single one.
There are more newspaper articles about the fires post-74. But The kind of attention is interesting. There's a sensationalism. These fires are arson. We've got to get the guys, we've got to get these young people who want to torch buildings for fun. If you look at arson arrests, you can see that a lot of young people talk about how they were paid by someone to torch the buildings. You don't hear about the folks who hired these young people, the landlords, or anybody else.
Is it a difficult thing to set a fire?
I would say no. Not more difficult than walking down a street.
What's the main motive that people operate on?
The money. There's a lot of money to be made from arson.
The housing was no longer viable for the landlord as a place to make money. You take the rent, you don't fix anything, you don't pay the taxes, and the last step is burning it. Hire a gang to burn it.
The landlord and their arson teams, they learned that the best place to start a fire would be on the top floor, and the fire would go up in there and just take off and spread across, and then it hits a corner, and then it starts to drop down. So now you got 2 apartments going, then a third and a fourth, and then the water floods down through the building, and just tremendous destruction.
In the community, we knew that landlords were burning their buildings. We just didn't know how much money they made or how they got away with it.
The state sets up an insurance pool so they can dole out policies in places where it's impossible to get a fire insurance policy. Landlords would kick back money to these insurance brokers who'd come in and, look at an abandoned, half-burned-out building in some neighborhood in the Bronx and say, oh yeah, it's worth $100,000 easily. And everybody got paid, everybody got kicked back.
The state insurance pool paid out $10 million in 1974 alone. By the end of the decade, the insurance company, Lloyd's of London, paid out over $45 million in claims. That would be around $250 million today. And those are just the payments I could find records for because of a federal investigation. Who knows how much was paid out by other insurance companies? What I did learn was that once they collected the insurance, landlords weren't required to fix the buildings. They could just pocket the money and walk away. And they just got away with it. Arson unit prosecution activity, 61 felony convictions. That's all, out of 4,000 suspicious fires that year in the Bronx.
The city does have fire marshals, somewhere between 60 and 70 for the entire city of New York. Because there are so few marshals for such an appalling number of fires, most battalion chiefs simply label a suspicious fire in a vacant building as cause unknown, thereby avoiding the need for an investigation.
So, I find this memo. It's called the Evaluation of the Fire Department's Program for Combating Arson in the City of New York. The city should not implement the proposed fire marshal surveillance program. We do not feel that any increases to the present force of marshals should be made until this evidence is presented. The Office of Management and Budget. The only way a fire gets investigated is when you call a fire marshal. They're saying that there's no proof that bringing on more fire marshals would solve the problem of arson.
And there was no questions asked. They collected, and they walked away from the buildings. And in my time, I can honestly say of the thousands of fires that I witnessed, nobody ever went to jail.
Mayor Abraham Bean says falling revenues and rising costs have now ballooned the budget deficit to $1 billion, $300 million more than projected last fall.
There can no longer be any doubt that without appropriate federal assistance, there will be a municipal default in New York by the end of the year.
When the city is essentially bankrupt, ask the federal government for a loan.
I am prepared to veto any bill that has as its purpose a federal bailout of New York City to prevent a default.
They're able to convince the president to give the loan to New York, but it's only in return for massive budget cuts.
New York City's budget was now under the control of a non-elected state body. Nicknamed Big Mac, this panel ordered deep cuts in all city services.
The sharply reduced level of spending has meant the loss of more than 40,000 city jobs in the past year and reductions in service in all areas, altering life across the city.
Since 1970, the fire department had been cutting its ranks. Their force of over 12,000 firefighters would eventually be reduced to less than 8,000.
Now, the fire department was cutting before the city collapsed. We were cut to the bone, and we were cut deeper than the bone when the real cuts came in 1975.
They continued to close fire companies in the South Bronx.
To date, with these 14 companies that have been eliminated over the last 2 years, we've lost 82 lives. This is complete madness again, and people are going to die.
There were nights you could have several major alarm fires going in the Bronx. You had companies coming in from Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens. At the same time, the companies that did respond were late.
And all of a sudden, neighborhoods just went floosh, gone.
It would look like a tsunami.
The burning of the Bronx eventually spread right across the Grand Concourse, right to the Harlem River, and eventually it worked its way up to near Fordham Road.
This here doesn't explain a true response to the abandonment, the devastation, the neglect. There hasn't been a response that comes close. Not even close. And then the lights went out. The 77 blackout, it was devastating. Over 1,000 fires burned that night. People have been imploding for so long. The next day, we heard that there was a lot of looting on 3rd Avenue, Southern Boulevard. Prospect Avenue was destroyed. And that's where my father worked in a furniture store. My father lost a job he'd had for 17 years.
The neighborhood is a place to live and a place to make money. If the neighborhood is deteriorating around you, are you going to stay? Or are you going to stay?
was 15 years old. I know that I needed to leave the South Bronx. But I didn't have the vision to think about where, how. We're all in this together and we're all falling. I was focused on making sure that I would at least graduate high school. I wanted to go away to college. My parents decided to split up, and my mother moved back to Puerto Rico. There was nothing left to keep me here. After all that we went through, was this really how it was going to end?
High pop to the left side. Say goes to the railing. He's got some room, and he makes the catch. That is a live picture, and obviously a major fire in a large building in the South Bronx region of New York City. My goodness, that's a huge place.
It was the World Series. Millions of people were watching the Yankees play the Dodgers. A few blocks away, a school building was burning to the ground. The Bronx had been burning for 10 years, and we were finally getting the world's attention.
That's the very area where President Carter trod just a few days ago.
I came downstairs, and the president was right in front of the building around 9 o'clock.
You blinked twice.
No, I didn't, but I said, wow, you know, what are you doing here?
But we need more money, Carter, because I think
I feel good about this. See that he cares about the South Bronx.
I hope you don't forget us when you go back to Washington.
Once we decide to renovate block by block, we just need to concentrate forces here.
All the attention and promises raised hopes in the community, but the money never arrived. Then Carter was replaced by Ronald Reagan.
because almost 3 years ago,
What are you going to do for us?
I'll get there. Can't do it.
Not by yourself, but you can put a word in for us.
I am trying to tell you that I know now there is no program or promise that a president can make that the federal government can come in and wave a wand and do this.
Go back to Hollywood. We don't want you.
President Reagan, in his televised speech on the economy, proposed 83 major program cuts. It was another blow to the South Bronx.
It didn't seem to matter who was in power. No help was coming for the South Bronx. When I went to SUNY Albany, it was a big transition. It was like moving to another country in many ways. Yep. It was so different. When I got to college, I wasn't prepared. A professor said, "Hey, where'd you come from?" My freshman roommate told me flat out that I wasn't going to make it because I came from the South Bronx. But I had friends from the city. We all kind of like stuck together, whatever we needed to do to survive and to stay, because that was the issue. We're going to stay. We're going to make it.
You go to college, and then you come back. So you reach this moment where you feel the need, I need to get out. What brought you back?
Visually seeing, wait a second, not all communities are like where I came from. So that sense of injustice, the sense of anger. Even before I graduated, I started coming back. After my freshman year, I spent the summer recruiting kids from my neighborhood to go to college. I worked with the assemblyman of the district. He would open the office on Saturday mornings so we can invite high schools to come to his office to recruit kids of color. In my second year, I came back to work on tenant organizing and voter registration. Around this time, Fort Apache showed up, a Hollywood movie that started filming here.
Fort Apache, the Bronx. The fuse has been lit.
We were sick of seeing our community being used as a backdrop, of hearing that we set the fires, of seeing these racist stereotypes used as entertainment. We'd had enough.
If no one else wants to fight, we'll fight. And I'm sure that I could get all the women in the Bronx to go out there and fight.
Already, the Gemini Theater has canceled it. That was our first victory of the day, and the movie has been pulled out of Philadelphia entirely.
The fight against Fort Apache was a part of something bigger. My generation knew we'd been left behind, so we would have to recreate the world ourselves. Some of us were inventing hip-hop in South Bronx basements, while some of us were figuring out how to save our blocks.
I stayed because the majority of my basic family is here.
I want a good neighborhood. I want to be safe. I want not to worry about my kids when I go to work at night. Worry about my wife when she's home sleeping. And this is where I have all my faith in.
This was my first business. It was doing great. I just didn't want to let go.
That spirit became contagious. Stay, fight, and build.
I knew that success was to keep the houses here and the people here and interested in staying here, no matter how crazy it might have looked.
Hetty moved into abandoned buildings on her block to keep vandals from gutting them. Then started after-school programs for children.
Let's try to say the Zulu all by itself.
I thought, I don't think I want my block to disappear. I think I had a good time growing up on that block.
On Lyman Place, there is now a sense of hopefulness.
The federal government and state lack the compassion and interest in our people. And what we're saying is that this is our piece of land, this is our stake in our future, and this represents our last hope.
I saw that in our neighborhoods, there was natural resources. We had the people, then we had the buildings, and they were idle. To me, it was a very natural, type of progression. That if we have the resources, all we really had to do was just bring those resources together and make them effective.
1186, 2 years ago, was an abandoned, city-owned building. I made a commitment then I was going to put this building back together.
We started out with just a half a dozen of us coming to the neighborhood on the weekends, cleaning the apartments because they were full of garbage and all that.
Ramon Rueda and his friends founded the People's Development Corporation. They were one of the first groups to start rebuilding in the South Bronx.
That was one of our buildings under the 312 program.
This tall one here?
Yeah, we renovated that building, and this was vacant. We had a carpentry shop, so we actually trained the young folks the skills of cabinetry while we were training people to rebuild their homes. I tell you, the success of People's Development was really the people.
Basically, a bank uses equity as a down payment you would use towards something, and the down payment that we put here is sweat, our own labor, our own time.
Is this your apartment here?
Yeah. Yeah, me and my boyfriend are gonna live in here.
Is that why you're taking special care with the floor?
Yes.
How do you like working on your own place?
Yeah, it feels great. I want it perfect.
Around that time, a friend of mine said, come over and see this group on Washington Avenue. Here were people who had taken abandoned buildings and not only renovating them for future homes for the people who were there, but people were also learning the construction trades, they were earning money, and I said, wow, this is like a dream come true.
Inspired by the People's Development Corporation, Organizer Harry DiRienzo teamed up with his neighbors on Kelly Street, who were determined to save and renovate their own block.
This is Banana Kelly. You can see by the curve of the block. It's curved like a banana. We had abandoned buildings on the block. We had these three was abandoned, plus across the street was abandoned.
On Banana Kelly, we sit around and talk about things like the neighborhood and where things were going. So that's where I met Robert Forster, that's where I met Leon Potts.
Banana Kelly's idea or purpose in organizing has been to try and save our neighborhood. Save it in a way in which the people that live here will somehow be able to control their housing stock, some of the jobs in the neighborhood, be able to control the neighborhood they live in. The reason we're trying to do all these things is to show an example to the rest of the people in the neighborhood that if you just try.
People from the area slowly got involved because they went to Washington Avenue and said, oh my God, look at this. These people are like us. They're doing work, they're learning stuff, and they're rebuilding these buildings, and they're going to live here.
These buildings, they had solar panels on the roof, they had wood grain floors, beautiful modern apartments, and it was like, oh, we can have this?
People were saying, what kind of fools are you? You don't own those buildings. What are you doing in there? You're working for free? What are you, crazy? But it was something about the people that I was working with. They didn't want to give up. So we took over 3 buildings and just started to clean them out.
Tearing down the walls, the ceilings, with no lights, all types of weather. It was really scary work. I thought it would be impossible. But every day, we would see more and more people coming together to do this. And if they were here, I'm going to be here. Made me stronger, made me better. And I want to achieve something. I'm proud of that.
Hi, how you doing?
Throughout the 1980s and 90s, dozens of grassroots organizations like 52 People for Progress were using music, culture, and community to bring the neighborhood back to life.
I just decided that I wanted to do something for my playground. It was dilapidated, and the Parks Department didn't look like they were going to do much to it, and I lived in the area, and I wanted to give something back. And we said, come on, let's bring this band to the park. People were longing for culture or for the arts or for something. We just filled the void. Just we came at the right time, and we filled it.
If it wasn't for us being here, the park wouldn't be like it is right now. It'd probably fall into everything else that we know that's going on.
The sounds of children, what they do is healing. The rhythm started coming back, and I was tuning the block like you tune an instrument. Are there kids out there playing? And do they have that pitch of happiness?
Hetty also had to take on the city to save her block.
This house was empty. The one over there was empty. The city was going to close down this block.
Rather than rebuilding, the city wanted to shrink the Bronx population, moving people out and demolishing our buildings. Hetty helped her neighbors to organize to keep them from being unfairly evicted.
We had to meet once a week to try to counteract the city's effort to throw everybody out.
Tenants all over the Bronx, including my neighbors at 986 Leggett, pooled their resources, paid for their own gas and oil, and managed their own properties. That was the beginning of the largest tenant-run co-op program in the country. Community organizing is what finally stopped the fires. A coalition of Bronx residents and clergy members demanded that the city take action. Because of this pressure, the fire department finally assigned an arson investigation team to the borough in 1982 and the fires began to slow down. After the fires, the people in the Bronx hung onto their blocks with almost no support.
Giving up is too easy. The hard thing is to stick in there and stay with your beliefs. If you show that you made it, maybe other people will do the same. I refuse to just walk away.
In 1986, their hard work paid off.
We want it to be permanent, affordable housing for those who are at the very bottom of the economic ladder.
The mayor proposed a 5-year, $4.4 billion program to build or rehabilitate 100,000 units of housing.
Banana Kelly and other organizations were finally able to begin massive rebuilding of the Bronx.
We're not asking for nothing personally. We're asking for it as a group. Not as savages, not as ghetto, as people. Just being people.
Those of us who grew up in the South Bronx, we carry this pride of having survived. Life is not easy for people today. That is part of the legacy of the fires. In the 70s, it was the fires. In the 80s, it was crack, right? And in the 90s, it was incarceration.
Right, the war on drugs.
There are these real systemic issues that are still plaguing communities like the South Bronx.
I had my first son in 1975. I thought, I'm gonna raise a new generation, a conscious generation. I became an activist. And then I went to college and I got my degrees and I decided, you know what? This is my community.
Right.
If I don't do something, who is?
The people who fought to save the Bronx are still here.
Right now, they could offer me any other place and I won't move. This would be it.
I'm still here too.
Good morning, guys.
I work with public schools in the Bronx to help young people finish high school and get into college.
Okay, bye-bye.
I want to pass this history on to my kids and all kids in places like the South Bronx. They should know where they come from. I want to start talking about where we live, like our place, the place we call home, and what that means to us. Have you ever had that experience where someone said, oh, you're from the Bronx? And then they made a comment? Like, what's the comment? So with a face.
We fight every day to get up in the morning, go to school. I feel like we're already fighting against the stereotype.
That's right.
And we're like proving other people wrong that aren't from the Bronx, that we are better and we deserve better.
One of the continuous line of connection between, old Bronx that we see disappearing and new Bronx, whatever is coming. But we're the connecting.
We're planning here 4 or 5 towers, about 16 to 1,700 fair market units.
Developers are moving in, looking to tear down and rebuild, creating upscale housing. Longtime residents and business owners wonder if it's just a matter of time before their Bronx is no longer theirs.
Developers want to carve up the Bronx all over again. This is happening everywhere, and it's probably happening where you are too. The same people that were redlined and neglected for years are now being displaced. But in cities across the country, we are fighting back.
Bronx Coalition for a Community Vision protested the city's rezoning plans for Jerome Avenue.
We are here now
any development, any upzoning, any changes should be made with us in mind.
What the city is going to allow is for new developers to come, tear down, and rebuild new housing in this area.
That actually happens in our building. The people move out and then they literally replace everything with marble tables, brand new sinks. Everything is like, looks like a little loft.
Like a lot of us are like a few paychecks for being homeless. So if you like raise the housing, raise the prices, then like that's scary.
Where is the young people's voice in what's happening to their environment in which they're living?
Safeguards, people that have been living in this community for over 50 years, who stood while the Bronx was burning, didn't move out.
I'm clear that I stand on the struggle and the blood, sweat, and tears of people who fought. Is the Bronx worth fighting for?
Yes, definitely.
I'm here to urge you to vote no on the proposed rezoning on Jerome Avenue. I was born and raised in the Bronx. I grew up in the South Bronx during the time that at least on record 150,000 people were displaced. We could never let that happen again.